Burwood Street, Detroit, Michigan. Along this ordinary road, in the heart of the Motor City's poorest ghetto, lies the Detroit Wall. Also referred to as the 8 Mile Wall and the Wailing Wall of Detroit, the 1941 construction of this 6-foot-tall, half-mile-long divider acted as a physical barrier between white and black neighborhoods during the 20th century. More than just a tangible division between two communities, the wall posed as a physical embodiment of racial attitudes that existed in Detroit. Rosa Parks arrived in Detroit in the summer of 1957. Parks and her family fled Montgomery in an effort to escape the employment discrimination and death threats that plagued their lives in the South, following her involvement in the Montgomery bus boycotts. Including her 40 years of activism in the Motor City, Parks spent over half of her life working towards racial equality in Detroit. Rosa Parks, like many other African Americans, fled the South in search of a better quality of living, and hoped to find a safe haven within the northern city of Detroit. To her dismay, racism in the northern city was almost as widespread as Montgomery. In the words of a Detroit suburb mayor, "These people are so anti-colored, much more than you in Alabama." The most noteworthy instances of discrimination were found within the housing and employment systems. The influx of African Americans to Detroit during the Black Migration weighed heavily on the housing system. The system, dominated by white Detroit citizens, worked endlessly to perpetuate the segregated communities throughout the suburbs. Black people faced tremendous difficulty when it came to obtaining bank loans and dealing with the white realtors. Those who were lucky enough to successfully acquire housing were faced with intense racism and discrimination. White citizens, who viewed their black neighbors as threats to the white stability, economic status, and political power, formed protective associations, or improvement associations, within their neighborhoods. They supported conservative politicians who opposed the integration of the city, tax increases, and public housing. In addition to the fierce opposition from their neighbors, black citizens were faced with inadequate living conditions. To white Detroiters, the desolate conditions of the ghettos were the fault of irresponsible blacks, not of the greedy landlords or the neglectful city officials. White officials sabotaged black living conditions by providing little to no services. Streets received minimal repairs, garbage overflowed, rat infestations were rampant, and plumbing was inconsistent and defective. In 1960, 27.9% of black homes were dilapidated or deteriorating, in comparison to less than 10% of white homes. Discrimination within the workforce was another hardship faced by black Detroit citizens. Race determined the types of jobs that were available to a person in the Motor City. Blacks competed with the white working class for the same jobs, including positions in meatpacking plants, auto plants, and the steel industry. Discrimination restricted alternative employment options for African Americans, and those who were lucky enough to find work accepted jobs with dangerous working conditions, unfair wages, and long, hard hours. The competitive nature of the working class job market intensified racism between the blacks and whites of Detroit's lower class. 85% of white working class citizens in Detroit supported racial segregation, in comparison to the 56% of the middle class and 42% of the upper income whites. In 1959, the average annual earnings of wage and salary workers of black men in the North earned $2,848, while white men earned $5,157. During her time in Detroit, Rosa Parks initiated a series of minor protests and marches to draw attention to the injustices that she and her fellow black Detroiters were experiencing. In 1963, the first major display of united protest was found in the Detroit Walk for Freedom. The march consisted of over 125,000 participants, carrying signs and moving in relative silence, protesting the housing and employment segregation within the city. The march was one of the largest protests in American history. Organized by the Detroit Council on Human Rights, the march protested unfair hiring practices, unequal wages, and the segregating housing system. Martin Luther King Jr. led the march at the request of his good friend, Rosa Parks. At the conclusion of the march, the crowd gathered at the Cobo Hall to listen to the original draft of King's I Have a Dream speech. 2 months later, King would deliver that iconic speech at the March on Washington. The Walk for Freedom embodied the nonviolent methods of protest that Martin Luther King advocated for during his time as esteemed civil rights activist. For the black citizens of Detroit, the practice of nonviolence was becoming ineffective and insufficient. Unhappy with the lack of reform that followed their peaceful march, the Detroit riots in the summer of 1967 were the first major instance of violent protest in Detroit. Following the arrest of 82 people at an unlicensed bar in the heart of Detroit's poorest, blackest ghetto, a crowd grew in response to rumors of police brutality. Bottles, stones, bricks, and garbage were pelted at police officers. Authorities arrived to the scene to control the chaos, but the crowd only grew larger and more violent. Fires burned down neighboring homes and businesses. Over 72,000 arrests were made, and 33 black people were killed over the span of the 5-day riots. While the rumors of police brutality acted as the initial catalyst for the riots, the underlying feelings of frustration and resentment towards the unfair housing and employment systems fueled the riots to rage on for 5 days and 5 nights. The riots were the biggest urban uprising to hit the nation until those that erupted following the death of Martin Luther King. The 5-day Detroit riots resulted in over $32 million of damage to the city of Detroit. The utter mayhem of the Detroit riots finally drew the attention of city and federal officials. In 1968, President Johnson appointed the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorder following the infamous Detroit riots. The commission called for major anti-poverty efforts and the strengthening of civil rights enforcement. The Fair Housing Act, also known as the Civil Rights Act, was another instance of reformative action to hit the nationwide segregation and discrimination issues that plagued the country. The prohibition of discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, or sex was declared by the Fair Housing Act. The act demanded that the government affirmatively further fair housing. In his address to the nation, President Johnson stated that the act was an enactment of first effective federal law against discrimination in the sale and rental of housing in the United States of America. The local Detroit civil rights movement was essential to the bigger national movement. The Detroit March for Freedom connected the city's struggle to that of the entire nation through the involvement of Martin Luther King Jr., the face of civil rights. The issues of unfair employment practices and housing were finally addressed on a federal level following the chaotic Detroit riots. Rosa Parks' 40 years of activism in Detroit following her famous involvement in the Montgomery bus boycotts helped the Motor City to gain national attention for its influence on the civil rights movement. The Detroit Wall, which once stood for segregation and racial inequality, stands today in memory of the struggle and hardships faced by black citizens of Detroit in the mid-20th century. Bright colors and murals adorn the wall in honor of the reformation achieved by the brave, hard-working black citizens of Detroit during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s.